Welcome to the Season 3 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar. Climate philanthropy globally and in India are starting to play a catalytic role for enabling climate action. They are starting to bet on innovative ideas and projects that enable decarbonization of key sectors, foster solutions that benefit communities and economies, and bridge the gap between philanthropy and commercial investment. To understand more about how climate philanthropy works, the different funding models, and the main challenges of funding climate projects, we interviewed Vikas Mehta, Executive Director of SED Fund, a venture philanthropy providing funding to organizations in India across their life cycle and continuing to support them in their growth and scale-up journey. Vikas has decades of experience in strategic planning, fundraising, portfolio management, and philanthropy.
Hello, good morning, Vikas. Welcome to the India Energy Hour podcast. I'm really excited, along with Shreya, to talk to you about and learn so much about climate philanthropy and how they operate, how they work. But as you know, we have a tradition in this podcast that before we start with the person's personal life and professional journey. And so you can go back as much as you want, but we would love to know how you became interested in this field. Like, what is it something that inspired you from childhood, or is it something you learned along the way? What's the story behind all this?
Well, thanks a lot, Sandeep, for having me on this podcast. I truly appreciate that. And, you and Shreya have got it to this point over the last 2 years that it's become one of the best podcasts out there on India, energy, and climate, right? So really privileged to be part of this today. Thank you. Well, as far as my own journey is concerned, it's a very checkered career that I've had, and I did not ever realize that I would be doing what I'm doing today. Growing up in the 90s India, I think that time it was very much a cliche thing for the kids to be thinking, or rather being forced into thinking about being a doctor or an engineer, or at the most an IAS officer. And my household was no different. I was being pushed in that direction as well. I personally wanted to be a cricket player, but my skills were never exactly beyond mediocre, I would say. So, but one thing I would say is that, growing up in Delhi, in a very hardy part of town, entrepreneurship was literally all around me. And a lot of my neighborhood friends, they had shops and small businesses and such. But I guess that was kind of, driving me as well, looking up to them and looking at how quickly can you make some money, right? That was all I guess I wanted to do in 95, 96. And which is when immediately after college, I started to work with 3 of my college friends to kickstart what was company to set up local area networks and wide area networks, if you know what I mean, in Delhi. And that's how my career started in the IT industry. So setting up these large networks with the companies and, large multinational corporations, which were coming up after India liberalized, and then, you had the market totally open up. So that was the start of my career. And then the dot-com bug bit me in 99. And with another friend of mine, I started off what was called chempros.com, which was India's first chemical trading portal. We did fairly well for about a year or so. We almost got venture funding by IDBI Venture Capital, but IDBI Venture Capital went bankrupt literally the week they were about to announce investment into us. So we lost a lot of money and cash flow in that process. And all the positive cash flow coming in from my networking business went into the negative cash flow of the .com. And it really kind of disappointed me and, made me first learn my business cycle as to how these things can go south as fast as they go north. And at that time, I was looking for new opportunities to, move away from what I was doing. And I was, getting a lot more interested on the social side of things, mostly by virtue of some of the volunteer work that I was doing in that period with the Road Track Club and the Lions Club and such. And it just inspired me to kind of work with a client of mine, which was Care India at that time. Now, of course, it's now Care International, but Care India at that time was doing some really breakthrough work in the space of microfinance and agriculture. And they took a punt on me, I should say, to hire me as a consultant to work on what was called the Andhra Pradesh Rural Livelihood Program. And this was a program which was funded by DFID, and it gave me an opportunity to cut my teeth into the space of working at the grassroots India. And I literally packed my bags overnight and moved from Delhi to Hyderabad to actually work in rural Andhra, which was now, of course, it's Telangana and Andhra, but this was the older Andhra, right? So it essentially was working in about 6 districts of Andhra Pradesh in terms of agriculture, microfinance, and sustainable livelihoods. I did not really understand what sustainable livelihoods meant at that time, and I felt that then, and I feel now as well, that sustainability is probably the most abused word in any non-profit space, writ large, right? At that time, it was even more so because so much of government funding and NGOs were really working in that space, and I did not understand what sustainability really meant. But I understood that much later. I'll come to that in a moment. And as I was working with Care India at that time, I realized that there was a need to actually bring in a lot more patient capital into the space and to really kind of, start working with a lot of private sector as well, and not just with the NGOs, because the farmers in rural India were not exactly your NGO types. They really wanted to understand as to, what would give them the next big harvest, the next, where would the next income come from. And with small land holdings, they could really not do beyond, I guess, living hand to mouth, right? So an aggregation, a leverage, more private capital was the need of the hour, which is what we started to do at Care. Sadly, that program didn't last for more than maybe about 2.5, 3 years. And then I kind of literally took that program and went to what was Oxfam GB at that point, which then transformed it into what was called the Cotton Textile Supply Chain Program. And we started to kind of work across the Andhra and the Vidarbha region with a bunch of farmer cooperatives and weaver cooperatives. And we started to kind of create these producer companies, which would then really take on a lot of the stuff around aggregation and organic cotton cultivation, and then weaving it into a fabric. And then eventually we tied up with Marks and Spencer and others to kind of, start using that fabric into, more sustainable and more long-term markets. And I think that experience really told me that markets and policies play an important role together. They can be a very chicken and egg effect on each other. But the reality is that for any kind of a development program to succeed, markets and policies have to come together. None of them can work in silos. And I would just take a step back and tell you that I was never a good student. And I could perhaps in hindsight blame it on my ADHD. But I think it was never something that really inspired me to kind of do my master's or my PhD. But by the time I was kind of, working with so many people from the non-profit space and from the government space and even the private sector space, I realized that I kind of had a shortcoming in terms of my own education, which is why so late into my career, I decided to do my master's. And I was given admission at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and I joined their Masters of International Business program. But I really wanted to focus on something which would make me work in the space of livelihoods, perhaps maybe agriculture or microfinance, because that was what my previous experience was. And it just so happened that while I was at the Fletcher School, I was introduced to working on case studies at the Harvard Business School with whom we had a partnership. And all of that experience really kind of, got me surprisingly into the renewable energy space. My first case study was with sun power. And it's just like, wow, this industry exists. I had no idea. And this is so much interesting, right? And I should also add that by that time, the phrase social enterprises had begun to kind of, take shape. And you had these investors so-called impact investors who were coming into the space, who were just literally coming into the global south. Acumen Fund had set up a shop in India just about 3 years before that in 2004. And you had others also coming in. But when I started to work in the space, we did not ever call it impact investment or social enterprises. It was just sustainable livelihoods. That's it. And by the time I was at Fletcher School in 2007, 2008, the impact investment space has really begun to kind of excite me. And I felt that if SunPower could do this at the commercial scale, what could happen in the space of, say, a typical social enterprise? And what are the opportunities for off-grid solar? In 2009, you remember Copenhagen. We all know the pains of it. So it was not a surprise. And it just gave me an insight to being an international relations school as to how difficult these conversations were going to be. And I was really made to kind of think about as to, okay, if Copenhagen could fail, where could we succeed? And I guess I was finding the answers in the field when after Fletcher, I started to kind of consult with MIT and their Global Challenge and Ideas program, in which so many startups came through the pipeline, and I was analyzing them. I was recommending them for investments and grants. And it just made me think that the innovation space could be perhaps one way to do this bottom up and to start to kind of, look at these ideas and look at, how these startups could really kind of bring about the next tech breakthrough, the next market breakthrough, the next financial breakthrough. Which is why after MIT, I joined this organization called the GAIN, or Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and which took me to Africa for the first time. And I work across 4 countries in Africa to set up what was a fund which would provide both grants and investments to companies, startups, which would be in the space of food, agriculture, nutrition, and rooftop solar. Which is where I think I first realized for the first time that, both droughts and downpours were happening across Eastern Africa, which is one of the most fertile spaces. Yet also, as you go north, it also starts to get a lot more arid. And I realized that climate change was already happening. And there was no way that I could think of climate change as the biggest threat. Yes, it is the biggest threat to humanity that we've ever faced, but I also realized that it was the biggest opportunity at that time. Opportunity to really transform the way we think about our economic systems, opportunity to the way we kind of think about our social systems and such, and how do we really bring about the change through the financial mechanisms. And which is why I was looking at options to kind of work in the climate and energy space, specifically starting around 2012, 2013. And it came about in the philanthropic space, which I did not really expect to join. I thought that I would be working likely in the impact investment or private equity side, which is what interested me the most. But then it just so happened that philanthropy came about. I started to work with the Global Climate Fund to internationalize their portfolio. They were a very US-based climate funder. And they sent me on this journey globally in terms of looking at how do you look at global climate philanthropy. And I traveled to a few countries, and then when I came back, I realized that what was important was to look at climate philanthropy from the lens of energy access and economic growth. Because global north has seen its economic growth over the last century by burning immense amount of fossil fuels, but that's not what the global south has to repeat. There are better ways to do it. There is a more ambitious way to do it. And by focusing on energy access and economic growth, you can bring them along rather than alienate them, and which is what I did at Growworld. But 4 years into it, and I realized that it was time for me to move on, simply because I felt that there were more innovative models I wanted to work on in the space of philanthropy, and the existing infrastructure or the space did not give me that space to kind of, to realize those ambitions. And India has always been a country that has been key to my heart, right? I mean, I'm an Indian and I live outside of India, but really haven't, taken India out of my heart. So I think in that sense, it was a place where I really wanted to kind of do more. So I started the SED Fund in 2018 with the only objective of creating more innovative philanthropy in the space of climate and energy so that countries like India can actually build a bigger pipeline of projects which can absorb climate finance for the future. So yeah, that's been my journey.
These innovative models that you're talking about, and given that your work focuses on India and similar such countries, how much of these innovative models are able to be on ground, able to function on ground in a country like India, where projects in this segment of energy transition or climate adaptation, etc., are just coming up. States are suddenly realizing that this is something that we need to be prepared of. You had started advancing in this area, but the growth here is slow. How do you match, what we call a market fit kind of approach? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it, Shreya? I mean, the thing is that there's no set framework to kind of match the markets to the policies and the policy making to the markets. I think it's a delicate dance that we have to do. And especially when you are a philanthropic fund as compared to, say, an investment fund, I think the dance becomes even more delicate because you have to balance the state or the government's priorities along with what is on offer in the innovation ecosystem. So when we were seeing this in, say, for example, Europe or in the US, I mean, such innovation came about in the space of looking at what kind of, tech startups could be there in the case of, say, demand response systems or battery storage systems and such. But when it came to more project-oriented work, you could take an example from, say, the Just Transition Fund in the US, which has been working in the coal communities for the last 7-8 years now almost. And it really looks at how do you look at entrepreneurship development in those areas, right? And you kind of start to kind of look at existing tech and existing business models and start to scale them up through entrepreneurship in areas which are a bit more disadvantaged. So we wanted to kind of have a kind of a midway path to those. In India, tech development ecosystem, while of course, I mean, we have seen a lot of startups, go through kind of investment rounds in the last decade or so. We've reached a point where the bubble has kind of clearly gone through a kind of a growth and a maturity pathway, right? So these days, it's not new to kind of have a tech startup in India, but having a clean tech or a climate tech startup in India is extremely new, right? The clean tech space in India has not yet reached a point of growth. It is still in a point of, I would say, early stages of the growth, and maturity is still, a few years away, I would say. So for us on the philanthropic side, it always becomes important to look at some of the ambitions of the central or the state government. And then we start to kind of work backwards towards as to where are the areas where we have to look at the innovation ecosystem in a state, in a city, in a certain tech space, and start to kind of support those models which could really fulfill that ambition of the state itself. So the example being that, we support what's called Electron Vibe. It's an innovation accelerator in the space of utility tech. And you have startups coming in through the channel and getting accelerator support to really kind of, kickstart how to absorb more renewables in the grid, right? And that's something that we all know is a crucial challenge for the future. So if you start through small pilots, if you start through small technology additions and such, perhaps there's space to kind of do a more large-scale innovation in the future. So we come in at the early stage. We come in the stage wherein these organizations are just about bursting onto the scene. So more like a pre-seed stage, and give them grants to kind of come to the point where they actually become a little bit more investable, a little bit more scalable.
Okay, great. So I just want to go back to a basic question, and then we can, deep dive into what are the different kinds of projects that different philanthropy support. But let's start by kind of, if you can paint a global picture of, how climate philanthropy works, which are the big ones, what is their model? Are they all aligned together or they're working in silos? And within that, if you can talk about SED Fund and what is the vision and the mission of the SED Fund. So first the global scenario and the story, and then kind of where SED Fund fits in those schemes of things, basically.
Well, that's such a massive question, isn't it, Sandeep? I mean, the thing is that you could totally do a full podcast on as to how these international philanthropies, especially in the climate space, work. and still not finish the podcast in time. But let me see how I can summarize that. See, it's a bit of everything. Climate philanthropies in the global north is definitely a lot more mature as compared to, say, the global south. Well, philanthropy overall, I mean, if you look at in the global north, is fairly well documented and well set with the various family trusts and various large foundations having been set up almost over a century ago, starting with the Rockefeller Foundations of the world to more recent ones like the Gates Foundation or the Bezos Earth Fund, right? These are some of the biggest foundations operating in the philanthropic space more broadly. Climate philanthropy is probably, I would say, not more than 20, 25 years old. I mean, I guess as old as perhaps maybe the COP itself, or a little before that, but not much more than that. And also, I guess the definition of what constitutes as climate has also been evolving over a period of time, and the kind of work that these foundations could support has evolving. So more broadly, I would say that, you could think of climate philanthropies in the space of, say, number one, the more endowed foundations, in which there is a certain endowment coming in from a certain revenue generating company or an organization, which then that endowment gets invested into the market, and then the returns essentially support the grant making of that foundation. Then on the other hand, you have what are called so-called regranters. And perhaps you could say that SED Fund could be a regranter in that loose way, in the sense that we try to create a strategy or kind of a grant-making portfolio or a plan, which essentially then draws from various philanthropic sources, high net worth individuals, even companies at times, to kind of, push a certain mandate, which is, in some cases, it's top-down, in which the organization would create their own strategy and then, try to sell that to the other agencies and then get funding from them to kind of deploy it elsewhere in the world or in a certain country. But for us, and perhaps for many other foundations like ours, I think it has to do with the bottom-up approach in terms of looking at what are the local ambitions, what are the local policies, and who are the key organizations operating in that space. And we try to kind of combine their strategies into our strategy and then sell that to kind of raise more money, and then to kind of deploy that where those strategies are in line with the state ambitions and the local economic growth and energy access ambitions. So that's a second kind of an organization. The third could be, I guess, a more like a glorified regranters, in the sense that these organizations would be running their own philanthropic programs in one country or multiple countries, but then they also kind of sometimes, do some regranting. Now, a caveat out here is that a regranting in this case would be dependent upon the laws of the land. So if the country allows regranting, then yes. Otherwise, it'll mostly be like just the implementation of a program. So these are by and large it's a very simple space, structurally speaking, in terms of how these philanthropies are structured around the world. But do understand that while the global philanthropy could be running in a few hundreds of billions of dollars, if my numbers serve me right, as of just last year, climate philanthropy globally was not more than about $7.5 billion. And this jump has also come only post-pandemic, because I guess many of the large families and high net worth individuals across the world have realized that what COVID has done to us in terms of political, economic, social systems, climate change can do much worse. And as it hits like a slow train wreck, there needs to be a space for us to kind of see it from the angle of what world are we going to leave our future generation. And that is important to quite a few high net worth individuals across the world. And I know quite a few of them who really think of this as an existential issue of their generation for the future generation. So they are kind of putting a lot of this money with no strings attached, no ulterior motives in terms of how they want to make sure that they serve the future generation, and whatever they have earned, it gets deployed for a better purpose. Now, to your other question. So you could say that we are a regranter and we do not have an endowment that we work off of. we aggregate funding resources from multiple high net worth individuals and some of the large organizations, but we do not run any of our own programs in any of the countries that we operate. And what we do is that we try to, as I said, get the ground up strategies into our own investment strategy, and we try to work off of that in terms of what works in key countries, right? And for us, I think what's really important is essentially, and I mean this in a very solutions oriented way, is that what matters for us is decarbonization in the power sector, in the space of steel, cement, and to kind of bring about solutions which work for the communities, work for the local economic ecosystem, and for the governments, right? So we certainly are not in the camp of anti this or anti that. What we are out there to do is how to kind of bring about these key ecosystem players, fulfill the gap of where philanthropy could de-risk a lot of the future investments or the future stuff around, say, states' policies, and then really help build that to the point where it become more commercially investable. So that's what we focus on.
And if I say ask from the point of India, what do philanthropic organizations look for in India? What are the kind of priority areas, and what kind of models work here? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, India is a federal structure, right? So the one model would never work. I mean, the states in the country are as important, if not less than say what happens at the central government level, right? So, but yeah, India is a large country. It has a large base when it comes to the infrastructure. It has a large base when it comes to the entrepreneurs. It also has a large base of public sector or state-owned enterprises, right? So they all need to be partners in any kind of a change that happens. And actually, I would just take a step back and say that for philanthropies, not just in India but anywhere else, I think what will really help is to to listen to the ground and to really start building the strategies from bottom up and not be prescriptive. Right? You cannot, as an international philanthropy or even as a domestic philanthropy, cannot tell to the government, to the local ecosystem as to what is right for them. So you have to listen to them. You have to work with them to really craft your strategies and your investments or your grants. So I think in the Indian context, I mean, when you look at the mitigation side, I think it's really important to see as to, how the renewable energy innovation has to take place at the level of off-grid and microgrids, because that's where energy access becomes extremely important. In the utility scale, I think perhaps barring some tech support, everything else should be left to commercial capital and perhaps to international institutional finance. And then in the space of when you look at adaptation, I think we are just about scratching the surface when it comes to natural carbon capture, sequestration, afforestation and such. I think not just India, but Amazon or even Europe has lost a lot of forests over the last century. So how do you make sure that that gets either rewilded or supported for future afforestation efforts and such? And what role do philanthropies have to play in addition to the local nonprofits and the local governments? I think that's something which we are just about beginning to scratch the surface of. There are already a lot of programs happening across the world on this, so there's some good examples. But for India, every state would be different. Every state has different levels of natural resources, and how it has been a player in the growth of fossil fuels over the last century, and how those changes are happening is going to be different. And I feel that for philanthropies, it will really help to partner with those local ecosystems and never be prescriptive.
Great. So I have like three questions with three parts. First is you broadly painted the picture. I'm trying to push you here a little bit on the broad topics, the priority topics, but I'd love to hear some examples. So that's question number one of what are under each category some of the projects that make sense or have had impact or is or is within the priority of SED Fund, but larger Indian philanthropy as well. So that's question number one. Number two, when you fund organizations, are you funding individual leads or you're funding an organization, or it depends on the project, it depends on who Because from some funders, I've heard that while they do fund one or two organizations, regardless of who is leading, but in others cases, like they're looking at who's the person, do they have expertise, or a combination. So that's my second. Maybe let's start with these two. I have one more follow-up so that, I don't ask a long list of questions. So the first one is a few examples, especially those that had any impact. And the second is about like, what's the model of funding? Like, how do you select what to fund and what not to fund?
So I already gave the example of Electron Vibe in terms of how it is, supporting the tech startups to actually help the utilities absorb more renewables in the grid. I guess another example that I can give is, we had a grant to an organization, a think tank in Delhi, to start to look at what was happening across various sources of power generation when it comes to not just generating the amount of terawatt hours, but also in terms of looking at what kind of resource use was they having, water use, land use, air pollution, the financial mechanisms through which they have been supported in the past and currently. And also, what kind of policy regimes were they really operating under? What kind of PPAs those projects had? So how do you really start to kind of, get that data together? And one thing led to another, and over a period of the last 3 years, that has become what's now called the India Climate and Energy Dashboard. And this is something that I hope I can say this, that this is now being absorbed by the Niti Aayog. And they will be looking at, putting this up on a NIC server, which will really kind of, out there help a lot of analysts and, in the future to kind of think about how do you really go about planning for power projects, right? How do you go about the areas where there is little to no energy access, and how do you really start to kind of, focus on those solutions in those parts of the country? So that's one example. I think this was done through a grant, and we believed in the power of the data, and we believed that that giving it a more meaningful twist would perhaps really help people to start using data in a more meaningful way. And I can give you another example that post-COVID, especially post the Delta wave, again in India, I mean, we realized that there was a need to turbocharge some of the projects which were stuck for post-COVID, right? So we started to support what was called the database on shovel-ready projects. And this database was meant to look at various projects at grid scale, off-grid, even battery storage projects and such, which would take support from the investment community and really kind of get off the ground. And one report led to another report, and that second report has now led to creation of what's now a deal syndication platform, which will be launched sometime later this year. And this will really bring together the investors and the policymakers and the developers together to look at those projects and start to kind of break down the barriers, and so that we can move towards 500 gigawatts by 2030 as fast as possible. The government has already shown its ambition in terms of now showing that they want to do more tenders every year, 50 gigawatts per year. There needs to be kind of a push from the other actors as well to see as to where those barriers are and how they can be broken down for such investments to kind of actually take place. So this deal syndication platform is an effort in that direction, right? Now, to your other question, Sandeep, yeah, I mean, organizations are a function of their individuals, aren't they? But not just one individual. I mean, leadership matters a lot. But what also matters is as to who are the second in line in terms of leadership, third in line, and, also in terms of how does the leadership really kind of, provide support to every single team member to grow, right? And that is something that we really look forward to when it comes to do our due diligence for our organizations. And every organization we support, it either has to be a new organization or it has to be a new project with an existing organization. That's one of the basic criteria we follow. And when that happens, what you do is that as a funder, you are kind of, being a part of something at a seed stage. And you do really give a lot of opportunities to the leadership in that regard to kind of, bring it up from scratch. And we not just provide grants, but we would also provide what's called an organization development support. And this OD support takes form of everything from executive coaching to looking at fundraising support in the domestic and the international space, and also to how do you really kind of build a second line of leadership, right? And this is important for not just the sustenance of the existing projects or the existing organization, but also as we look to kind of exit in a few years from that organization, we just want to make sure that that organization is investable, is fundable by other larger organizations or larger investors. So I think that is a basic ethos of our grant picking approach, that early stage organizations or early stage projects are the ones we go with, and we support with not just grants, but with the OD support as well.
Because I was curious to know, you might evaluate proposals and projects and look out for projects, but the law of the land also matters a lot, especially when we are living in a day and time of changes in the regulations, say under an FCRA. What do you do in such a situation? You might already be, say, invested in an organization which has faced some or the other kind of regulatory action in a country, or you're about to give proposals to something and now they have landed in trouble, or with the changes in laws that keep happening in countries like India or others as well. FCRA being again my reference point. How do you address that then?
Yeah, it's a great question, Shreya, I think, but I will just limit my response to the SED Fund's approach to this rather than the broader philanthropic or climate philanthropic space. Because for us, I think what matters is the law of the land. And we follow this to the letter, not just for ourselves, but also with our grantees. We make sure that everybody who essentially gets into the grant portfolio at SED goes through a due diligence process, which ensures that nobody is flouting any local laws. And we have a whole team of analysts who essentially kind of look at that diligence. And I feel that, yes, no doubt that in the specific Indian context, the FCRA laws and the changes in those laws, especially over the last 2.5 years, have made overall grant making a little bit more challenging into the country. But I do understand that the government wants to streamline the process. The government also wants to ensure that the funding goes to where it should. So for us, I think just following that law and following the process is enough. We don't need to second guess in terms of what other fund flows have to be there. I think what matters for us is that those organizations that we work with, they remain solutions oriented. They do not harp about just a problem. We do not aim to kind of work with organizations which essentially bring about a regulatory change or anything, because that I feel that gets us into a point wherein we are, in my opinion, I feel that doing something from the outside, and we should not be focusing on that. For us, what matters is that we work enough on the analysis of the research side. We work enough on the side of looking at any technical assistance that we can provide as a result of that analysis or research. And we look to do this in alliance with the local partners. And whenever I say we, I almost refer to the local grantees that we support. SED Fund by itself is never prescriptive about whatever changes have to happen. Our work is only a function of, as I have said before, of what the grantees tell us that this is something that they want to work on.
I have a question, which is, as Shreya asked about like the laws of the country, but let me ask you about the topics of the country. So each country has some topics which are very easy to find, within the broader energy climate space, because everybody loves good renewables, right? Like renewables is a happy story in India. Like by and large, I don't know if any stakeholder, I mean, some people complain about renewables because of intermittency, whatever.
I am that person.
I don't think that governments or organizations are like anti-renewables, very few, even if they exist. But there are some topics naturally within this space which are important, right? For example, and I'm going to be that person who's going to go ahead and say this, like phasing out coal in India. I mean, it's a topic I study a lot, but it's not a topic that government of India or many even state governments are ready to openly talk about. So is there a strategy for SED Fund that, okay, right now, or larger philanthropy, you can take this question from the perspective of larger philanthropy or SED Fund. Is there like a kind of, a strategy right now that right now we'll focus on renewables, But when the right time comes, we will start to focus on the other side, because decarbonization involves both, ramping up renewables, but you have to also bring down at some point. I'm not saying it's not possible in the Indian context right now, it's not possible for the next decade. But is there like a sharp divide between funding the happy story, 70-80% of your grants go to the happy story, and maybe a few projects go to the other side? This is the spirit of my question in terms of like understanding what are your priorities. Like, can you also fund the other side, which is not a happy story?
Okay, so let me just take the spirit forward. I would say, see, the thing is, Sandeep, in my personal opinion, it's not ideal to kind of think of this scenario as a binary. It's not a case of either or, right? See it from a very generic, and I don't. You could say this that I'm kind of saying this anecdotally. Yeah, I'll take that. But see it this way: solar, wind, these are technologies, right? Coal, gas, oil, these are commodities. And whenever you talk about commodities, you're talking about the supply and demand fluctuations, which essentially gives rise to not just changes in the price of these commodities, but also the affordability of the end users of these products, which ultimately also influences the inflation. And we've also seen over the last century what kind of geopolitics and the wars that these fossil fuels have caused. With solar wind, the marginal cost of production of electricity is next to zero. There's a large capex involved at the beginning of it. And yes, I understand that there are land constraints and there are constraints around, perhaps concerns around what the future critical mineral supply have to be. And, I think when we were on the podcast a few weeks ago that you had, person laid out very clearly in terms of how the supply have to be, where those new resource areas and countries will be, right? But see, I feel that on the overall tech adoption growth curve, solar and wind have come to the point where these technologies are ready for deployment everywhere, right? And we are already seeing that the cost of deploying new solar or new wind, whether offshore or onshore, is lower than the cost of, say, new coal. In some cases, even new gas, right? And we're already seeing that. For countries like India, who are well endowed with coal, but not so much with gas and oil, I think it makes obvious sense to kind of, fall back to the fossil fuel of choice and go with the incumbent option of as to, how they have to scale up energy access. No denying that, right? But what I would say is that Global South does not have to repeat the mistakes of the Global North, right? There is enough ambition, there is enough finance, there are enough resources to actually deploy large-scale renewables overall over the next decade, which would gradually negate the need for more coal capacity or more gas capacity, right? And on the philanthropic side, I would say is that, again, back to the point of the binaries, I would say that let's not look at either or. What is more important out here is that as you kind of start to kind of support the happy story, you will realize that there would be opportunities that you would not have thought of when it comes to scaling up more and more renewables, right? And when that happens, obviously, you would see that the fossil fuels will be priced out of the market. The infrastructure need would essentially start to kind of, negate. But then, we talk of net zero by 2070 and energy independence by 2047 in India. Do I think it'll happen before that? Perhaps. Do I think that, coal is probably going to be out in about 30 years? Very likely. But should I be kind of, forcing it out? I would say it's more complicated than just saying yes or no. What's important for me to say is that we want to focus on the positives. We want to focus on the solutions. We want to make sure that everybody, whether it's the government or the private sector or the local communities, they end up being a participant in this and nobody's left behind, or at least we try to do that, nobody's left behind when it comes to the transition of the workforce in these sectors, especially coal, oil, or gas, right? India has a lot of direct workers working in the coal space, millions of indirect workers, subsistent level of the people who rely on the coal economy. I don't recall as to what the numbers are, but they are like absurd numbers. So the overall transition will be slow. It will be messy. But it is on to us who are working in the space right now to ensure that at least we lay the foundation of it and we support the ambitions of the government and the local economies so that we can perhaps reduce, if not overall, offset the mess.
But just reiterating what Sandeep has also asked about, decarbonization will make you enter industries which are already, exposed to fossil fuel, which would technically not part of, say, the climate universe. Energy transition may be. The same gray area would apply to, say, critical mineral mining as well, where there are still issues of human rights, etc., coming up. So going forward, you would, organization, philanthropy organization, P investors would have to enter into these areas because these are the stepping stones to energy transition. It cannot be pure vanilla solar and wind anymore. So what is the plan then? How are philanthropic organizations looking at this possibility?
Well, if you have a plan, please tell me. I would love to kind of, pick your brains on that and make it into our strategy. Well, see, Shreya, I mean, we can make the best plans, but the reality of, technologies is that this is going to push us into a change of plan every year. You could make a 5-year plan, you could make a 3-year plan, but every year your plan could change based on some new reality, right? Before the pandemic, we did not really realize that, how quickly, some of the stuff would start to kind of take shape in the global north in terms of decarbonization. Before last year, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we did not realize as to how quickly Europe would realize its problem of gas and start to at least make some baby steps towards domestic or rather household decarbonization through heat pumps. I think those things are a little unpredictable, but you're right that decarbonization is not without its technological, political, and even ideological mess. And I think that's where I believe that we need to kind of literally be flexible enough with our grant making when it comes to looking at decarbonization. Whether that happens to be in the space of power sector or the industrial space, I think unless philanthropies are in it for the long haul, unless they actually kind of support the local ecosystems and unless they actually support the organizations with core support rather than just focusing on the project level support, I think philanthropies will find it hard to kind of play or rather stay in the game. It is very important that philanthropies look at the local ecosystems and build their strategies from ground up. I say it again and again because believe me, I have worked and traveled across 4 continents. And I can tell you that only the local strategies will work. So if you are coming in from the outside, whether you are international philanthropy or if you're even domestic philanthropy, listen to the ground. That's what's most important.
Speaking of that, I'm going to pick up a chain of thought that you started about like local organizations. I mean, from your conversation, it seemed to me they are the most important levers of change, right? Because they have a sense of the ground. But like in my experience, a lot of civil society, especially in like India, the global north, it's a different story, slightly different story. But they struggle with this like constant grant making process, who to hire. And like if you get 1-year grant, then again you have to like, I mean, from a cash flow and organizational strengthening point of view, this model of 1-year, 2-year funding, do you think this is really going to lead to those kinds of larger changes? Because everybody is just running to like, okay, like this docket and the next one, and we need to put something together, etc. So, I mean, just taking a step back, is there a larger plan to help, at least in the course of, all these years, there are some organizations, different philanthropies might have identified that, hey, they deliver and they promise something. So at least for those organizations, is there a strategy that, okay, we're going to support you for long term, right? This is not just like 1 year and then come back again kind of process. So I'm going, in circles here, but what I want to really understand is like, how would you support and really truly support an organization that can deliver and go beyond these 1-year cycles of grant making or 2 years of grant making?
Yeah, you really hit the pain point, haven't you, Sandeep? Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely with you to say that it's not just the grantees who do not like the annual cycle. Believe me, even the program teams in my own organizations do not like the annual cycle, right? But it has a lot of history in terms of how some of the foundations are funded, including ours. If we have a cash flow outlook for, say, only for 1 year or for 2 years, none of us can make forward commitments of more than the period than which we have our commitment for. That's one. But then the reality is a bit different for the endowed foundations in the sense that they also kind of go with the economic cycle side. If they are able to kind of make more money with their financial instruments in a certain year, they do want to kind of push out more money out the door in that year. So how it kind of ends up being downstream is that you are always going to have a handful of organizations which are given core funding, which are given multi-year funding. And then there'll be some experiments in terms of 1 year funding. But those organizations which are given the 1 year funding are usually the ones which are very early stage, very unproven models. And I guess the foundations are experimenting with those grants. But by and large, I would like to believe that organizations, or rather foundations, which are very serious about grant making in any space, should give core funding, should give multi-year funding. It eases the burden on the grantees to actually focus on the work itself and not to really kind of give reports every quarter. And it also eases the burden on the foundation's program team. I'll also say one more thing out here, that when it comes to the monitoring, learning, evaluation, and perhaps even the funder reportings, it is also incumbent upon the foundations to make it easy for the grantees. Most foundations do not do it. And in the space that I operate, I can vouch for the fact that a lot of these foundations, even for small grants, they kind of, sometimes go for quarterly reportings, which is very onerous for the grantees. If I'm a grantee, I'd rather actually focus on the work itself and then really, give a report on multiple indicators to a funder. But yeah, I mean, that's right now a gripe that I guess I'm willing to share. But I guess internally, we try to kind of minimize that burden on our grantees and try to kind of make sure that we are not that funder, right? We don't end up being that funder.
Just very quickly, you earlier talked about investing in, say, tech startups or innovations which are in the energy transition supply chain. Now, this is something that the not so big corporates, but some of the startups and entrepreneurs in the renewable energy segment are also dabbling their hands in. And they're all rebranding themselves. This is just my observation. They're rebranding themselves as this savior of India's energy ecosystem. And I fear that with their pitches, they might hog on to a lot of this climate grant money that is available globally. Are you also seeing a similar trend, or I'm just very suspicious?
I'm not going to nitpick or question how some of these startups or organizations are branding themselves or pitching themselves to the funders or the investors, right? I think let that be. I think from the space that they're coming, I guess that's a narrative they want to create, let that be. I'm not going to really take offense to that. But what I would say, Shreya, is that let's see philanthropy from a different lens. We keep on talking about philanthropy that would support some of the work around the policy or the some of the innovation ecosystem as such. But specifically in the space of climate, specifically in the space of international philanthropy coming into Global South, I like to kind of have the view that philanthropy is the gateway to actually enabling climate finance for the future, for the Global South, which is to say that if we are supporting the right organizations, if we are supporting the right projects, they are the pipeline which can absorb climate finance coming in the future. Yes, we keep on talking about climate finance at the COP every year. Yes, we keep on talking about how much we deserve, right? Yes, we do. In Global South countries, they absolutely deserve every single cent that they are demanding from the Global North. But do I think it's going to come in the form that which the governments negotiate? I don't think so. I think that we can expect climate finance to come from not just the government sources or bilaterals or the multilaterals, but climate finance will also come from the private sector. It will also come from the philanthropic side. And we need to be able to create a pipeline which can absorb that and make it its own and essentially create that country's growth story for the future, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So that's where I believe that the change in the mindset needs to happen, and even the change in the ambition needs to happen. Whether the ambition comes from the philanthropies or from the governments, we need to be ambitious about how do we really build that ecosystem on the ground.
Great, excellent. We have crossed 1 hour, but I have one last light question, which is like, what do you really enjoy about this work? Like, what gives you, like, let me ask it differently. What keeps you awake at night out of excitement and out of worry in this space?
Okay, that's not exactly a lighthearted question, Sandeep. What I enjoy about this work, I think I really enjoy working with so many different kinds of players, right? These are the people who are some of the best researchers out there. These are some of the best advocates out there. Some of the best, tech startups, some of the best guys working in the international relations space, in the international diplomacy space, right? I think my day literally starts off in the morning talking on issue X, and in the next hour, I move to issue Y and then to issue Z, right? And how do you connect the dots between all of these different issues and then try to kind of, bring them together? Bringing these unusual partners together is probably the best job that I have. I think even my team has started to kind of realize that I use, abuse, and overuse the word leverage, but that's what I truly believe in. I believe that, that if you can bring, say, somebody working on health policy together with someone working on, say, off-grid solar, well, that's something that, it's unique and, it's kind of almost unheard of. How do you kind of bring them together to kind of work on common projects and, bring them together to kind of scale up what they're doing? Seeing that impact is probably the best thing I really enjoy about my work. Now, in terms of what kind of keeps me awake at night, well, I think I still at heart feel that climate change is a big threat, right? So the kind of world that we will leave to our next generation, I do worry about that, right? Yeah, there are more immediate concerns that we have, all around us, whether it happens to be recession or happens to be, the education systems and the social systems and the pollution, all of that. But really, what are we doing to our world? I think that does kind of, bother me more broadly, and, perhaps it just inspires me as well to do what I do on a daily basis. So I guess it's both a threat that I feel, and it's also the kind of inspiration that kind of eggs me on to kind of do more.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been really great. It's been very interesting to learn the different models. I think for me, that was the real highlight in terms of like thinking about how different ways in which philanthropy is offering. So thank you for your time, and also best of luck to you and to SED Fund to achieve your larger mission.
We covered a variety of topics. We thought that we'd just talk about philanthropy, but we love digressions, me and Sandeep, and we are very happy we digress with you as well. So it was a great conversation. Thanks a lot again.
Thanks, Sandeep. Thanks, Shreya. I think what you guys are doing is really something that I enjoy, and I really look forward to it.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with a double I.